Welcome to Becoming Parents Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Campbell. I'm a doula in Washoe County, Nevada, a Medicaid provider, a lactation educator, childbirth educator, and mom of 18. You can find me and connect on doulainreno.com. Remember, give a shout out to those who are brave enough to share their stories with us on how they have become parents. Let's dive in. Welcome to Becoming Parents Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Campbell, and today I have Amy Stone with me. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to talk to you.
I'm excited. Also, I want you to jump in and share your parenting journey with us.
All right. So my parenting journey is, and I'll do it from the beginning, but with a little pre-story, which is that I was a step parent before I was a parent. So I have two kids and two stepkids. And so when I became a parent in 2003, wow, I had to think of the math there. My first kid was also the third kid in my house. And so that's 2003 I had a kid, 2006 I had a kid. There were kids 3 and 4 in my family.
Wow. So how many stepkids did you have?
I have two stepkids.
Okay.
They were 8 and 4 when I met them,
Okay.
and they were this is the math where I sometimes I should sit down and write these numbers down. So but they were about 13 and 9, 10 when my first baby was born.
Okay.
So
So you
big
waited a
age group.
while. Yeah. Wow.
Big age group, big age jump. Yeah, we waited some time before we got married. There's an age gap between me and my husband, and the joke was at one point that we did preschool and college all at the same time. So yeah.
Kind of. I mean, yeah, I have the same situation in my house too, but which is crazy. The age gap was, well, you knew what his like 3 year age gap was like, and you were around
Yeah.
when the kids were a lot littler. And then you know what a 10 to 13-year age gap looks like. And then how close are your two biological kids?
3 years apart. So
Oh,
2 years,
oh,
two
okay.
years and 9 months. So yeah.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on age gaps? The 10-year age gap is hard for me.
I think that there were definitely some challenges. Like many things, I'm upfront about the fact that I proceeded into my blended family and my role as a stepmom with all the confidence and in myself that you can only have when you're in your 20s. I was like, and people did try to caution me about it. And obviously, I didn't grow up under a rock, so I know that it's famously a hard journey. But I was just like, oh, it's fine. I'm nice. They're cute. What could possibly go wrong? I didn't think about it very much from the start, but it was immediately a challenge. I remember when the pediatrician came in to talk to me about having a newborn parent. She was like, "Listen, usually we tell people to be careful about taking the kid out, but she's like, these germs are going to come home to your house because you have older kids.
Mhm.
So that's not what you need to worry about." We when they were babies and toddlers, it was a challenge that the kids are doing completely different things. So we
Yeah.
had a newborn at the same time we had Little League,
Mhm.
and we once went to a theme park and the kids were playing rides. I live in Florida, so Disney is a thing, but we were outside of the Magic Kingdom window for the older kids. They wanted to do big rides, and the little kids, I was that weirdo sitting at like the playground, playing on the little things for hours, just sitting there. And I very quickly learned why they don't charge admission for people under 3,
Yeah.
because they don't do anything.
We did the same thing. We went to Six Flags with our kids, and all of them were above the age limit, except for the youngest, the 8 year age gap, right? And we ended up like just grouping the older kids. They grouped
Yeah.
together and went and did their thing. And we had check ins every couple hours because we were literally stuck with this 5 year old who couldn't go on anything.
Yes.
Even if she had, she was too afraid to go on some things. And um it was a great time. Everybody had a great time, probably except us.
Yes.
I would split off and go on a couple roller coasters with the older kids, and then we try to rotate a little bit, but those are the things you don't think about that make such a
Yes.
significant difference.
We very quickly, specific to theme parks, which maybe other people don't have to deal with this, we picked up a policy of offering to take friends, which
Oh,
is like expensive, but it meant that they were taking peers and they were able to entertain themselves. And so we weren't as tied together. So like if you, instead of having a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old and then a much younger one, we might have, two 16-year-olds that could run out. It didn't always work out perfectly. Like
yeah.
we would extend invitations and we made this. So we started this. It's also very helpful because then the adults don't have to go on the spinny rides
Yeah.
and that's what pushed this is that I realized that in my 30s, I could no longer go on the spinny rides, which was a really unpleasant revelation. But um,
That was my
the
husband too, but I love
yeah.
them. So,
Right. I still love roller coasters, but you put me on the spinning rides. I'm like, wow, this used to be fun. I don't know what happened. And so we extended an invitation for like a local festival. We were making calls and we are like, hey, we'll take your kids. And the other parents were like, you will? Where do we sign up? Thank you,
yeah,
sure. And we're like, yeah, because this way they're, so that's one of the things we picked up along the way was just, sometimes more kids made it easier.
yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Movies were the same way. And I like the older kids were so great and so kind and loved their little sister. And it was never a complaint, but we could not go to like a PG-13 movie that was like a superhero movie with a 4, 5, 6-year-old kid who could have potentially been terrified. Like she was not ready for the movies that the
Right.
older kids were ready for. And so when we went like as a family, we were seeing Finding Nemo and
Right.
you
Or
know
everybody
like
goes to different movies. Yeah.
age
Divide and
gaps,
conquer. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I mean the newborn at the soccer game, not the worst thing in the world, maybe
No.
stressful for you but not terrible. But there are a lot of things that divide your family when there's an age gap that you don't realize until you're there.
Right, because so there's the time. So we had a very funny movie story. It was really the person who drove the movie problem was my husband and not the kids. They were pretty good custodians of making sure that it was appropriate for the kids. But my husband was so ready to stop watching animated films that he's like, well, this will be fine. I think I remember what it is. And one time, one of the little kids popped up and was like, I don't think this is appropriate. And I was like, how off does it have to be when the kid is self-reporting? But and they were probably right. So that was definitely one of the things with movies. And then one of the challenges that I distinctly remember as the mom was that I sometimes felt isolated because the bedtimes. So when the older
Oh,
kids had evening things or afternoon things or mealtime, and I was like sometimes in a position where I was like, yeah, no, I can't go to the dance thing because if I don't get home and do bath time and bed and all of those things, my tomorrow is going to stink. And so that felt sometimes like it was divisive. It wasn't really, but I think it's one of those things in the moment where they say, the moments are long and the years are fast.
yeah,
In the moment, I felt like I was having to make a decision that was no fun.
yeah. We did the same thing, but my husband had to go to bed early back then, 10 plus years ago because of his job. And so that was the only saving grace. But that made me feel like I'm the only one responsible for, like, yeah, you two go to bed. That's
Right.
great. But that left, it always leaves one parent like trying to figure out how to juggle it all. But I was the one that was doing most of the rides in the morning and in the evening because my
Yep.
schedule was closer to their schedule. It is crazy. The bedtime is another one that did come up. And we had to adjust too. I mean, sometimes you just have to adjust because everyone's equally as
Right.
important. Right. Yeah. So
Oh
tell
my
me,
gosh, that's I think the big lesson that you before I did this in my own experience, I think I thought that it would be a choice between one thing or the other. But one of the things that makes it so hard is that everybody is important and worthy of being honored. It just is super, super hard.
I also think I wanted to, that's true. And everyone is equal and important. And also, you're a step parent. So
Right.
that's a different dynamic. So some of my husband's kids were most of them were the same age as my older kids, and so they all kind of fit in easily. Um, but I I had kids prior, so we both came in. It was really hard to be the parent who's like in charge of the rides or whatever, but not be the disciplinary parent for my stepkids and vice versa when it was him. There
Yeah.
was a weekend I had to go to a conference and he was the one on the weekend home for everyone. And we tried very hard not to be the disciplinarian for each other's kids. That was not my role. But then when you are left alone in a situation and there is no one else, by default, you kind of are if something comes up and needs to be
Yeah. And you
addressed.
have to be. Yeah. You have to be.
And
Yeah.
that was a really hard line to toe. So you have stepkids where you're not really the disciplinarian. There's another mom involved. You're not the mom. I was not the mom,
Right.
right? But yet you're in this position where you kind of are in that situation. So how did you navigate? And you didn't have experience parenting before. What was
I didn't.
navigating like?
So I'm very lucky that we have a pretty decent relationship with my kids, my stepkid's mom, my husband's ex. It's a civil relationship, and that can't be under prioritized because people who have these really high conflict, really, really explosive relationships and extended family, that makes it much harder. So I did not experience that. And so that's very lucky. But the thing we finally worked through and that I always offer to people is that um, no, I'm not the mom, but when the kids go to school, the librarian tells them the rules and enforces the rules in the library, and they don't look at her and say, "Hey, you're not my mom. You don't get to tell me what to do in the library." And so we did a lot of therapy and counseling and stuff like that. Anything we came to the point, and this is not the way many people. I was told to not parent the kids, but when you're alone or it's in the house and it's impacting your life, like you're saying, it's like, what else are you going to do? So the thing that we came to is really leaning into what are the house rules of our family, really making sure that those are very clear because then you're just enforcing the rules of the family and it doesn't matter as much who's doing it. And my husband and I really had to come to agreement about what was important. So I share this story all the time because we did end up in couples counseling over this. He had a lot of guilt and pressure about the fact that he had limited time with his kids and he didn't want to give them chores when they
Mm,
were over for the weekend. And that translated into I was living in a pigsty because I felt like I couldn't tell them to clean up. And that was not livable for me. I was like, these things are not actually, this shouldn't be. I don't care if aliens come down at 5:30 and pick up the toys, but we have to agree on the house being clean and standards for how we're going to live and that's not the same you can clean it up. You
right.
don't have to give the kids chores. That's fine. But then that shifted again when I added more kids because there's a layer of having two different standards
Oh,
for kids in the same house. And
right.
that is actually a place where the age split sometimes played in our advantage, right? So I've got, we were able, like the oldest got a phone when she was 13, and we just made that the rule for all the rest of the kids.
Yep.
And, no rhyme or reason, like this is the rule. And so forever, all future
Right.
children follow this.
We did the same thing. 12. Yep.
But they didn't remember who was cleaning up their room or emptying the dishwasher for the oldest. So there were sometimes different standards. But meals, I had to have to figure out a way when it was just the stepkids and he wanted to cater to every whim and fancy for what they were eating. I really didn't care because I was a stepmom and I would just eat, a bowl of cereal on my own when I was feeding the younger kids and was like, no, this is mealtime. And I,
Yeah.
Amy, am not going to make 27 different options. Then I had to figure out what were we going to do in the house,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I agree. And you're right. You just set up rules like we used to have family council, I called it.
Yes. Yeah. Family
And
meetings.
yeah, and basically we'd sit down at the table and say, how do we want to do chores? How do we want to do dinners? How are we going to do things? Because we didn't have my kids and his kids at the same time all the time.
Right.
So there were, times it was just his or just mine or everybody. So how are we going to break that down in different ways? And you're right, you're not a heavy if it's a house rule.
Right.
Uh,
That makes it works pretty well. It doesn't, none of this works all the time, right?
no,
None of it works. And that's one of the other, and the other thing is the day that I figured out, because and not everybody goes through this, but I used to feel a lot of pressure if the stepkids would come and say, hey, well, this is the way my mom does this at the other house. And at first that felt like a lot of pressure. But eventually it was just like, oh, okay, thank you. That's great. Maybe I'll borrow that. Maybe I won't. Maybe it'll just be different. But when I realized that it could just be different.
yeah.
And that was fine. That was a helpful stage for us.
And kids do that a lot. Um, and I just adopted the policy with any of the kids. Like things can be different at all the
Yes.
at houses, and that doesn't make them good or bad. It makes them different. I like knowing because maybe I do want to change things. Like
Right.
maybe it would be easier to do it this way. So share all of this and just know that then we have to figure out how it's going to work at our house. And if it's not the same, it's not the same. And yeah, I mean, I was
Exactly. Like the famous example of that is grandma. Like people go to grandma's house and grandma has a whole separate set of rules,
right, right. Yeah,
and
it
it
can be
works.
different. Yeah, it does. And I was always like, as long as there's no neglect or physical abuse or emotional abuse, like,
Exactly.
then I don't care how dad does it or your mom does it. I couldn't care less. If you're trying to have this conversation as kids that were teenagers to kind of make the transition easier, let's have a conversation
Yeah.
about that. But I can't be the only one moving my life around in order to do this. It's so fun. Tell me, what did you do
Yeah. Yeah.
for work before? Because your life dramatically changed when you got married and had stepkids, and then again 7 years later when you had your first child.
Yeah, so it sure did. Okay, so I did a thing that I would not actually suggest that other people do, but I did not consider that it could go wrong. And it didn't for me, but it does for a lot of people. I actually bought a house with my boyfriend before we were married. So when we were dating, and he and I met through work. So I was working in a finance company, and so we were dating and we bought a house together. And then I very instantly became a part-time I wasn't a stepmom, but a part-time resident with these kids who came over every other weekend and one day during the week. That was a massive shift. That was a massive shift. Then we got married. And then I retired and came home as a primary caregiver when I had kids at that point. So I was in marketing, communication, and service for a .com company before I had kids.
Oh, nice. Well, that you can translate to anything, really. So those are great skills. And then how you continued on. When did you start Imperfect Adulting?
So, Imperfect Adulting is my newest project. It was percolating in the back of my mind last year, 2024. If I had paid closer attention, I would give you an exact date, but it was just kind of a
That's
thing,
fine.
an idea that came. And then I launched the show and the membership in January 2025. So it's pretty new. It's pretty new.
This is great.
Before that I call this the rule of 35, which is whatever your hobbies and pastimes are when you're 35 years old, you will transition into coaching for those things. Um, like, so maybe it's Pilates,
Interesting.
maybe it's yoga, maybe it's a professional thing like you're in management and you step into training. It's a joke, the rule of 35, but it's so funny how so many of us do that. It's like, oh,
I'm
I'm
like,
gonna
there's no way. And then I started to think back and I'm like, holy crap.
exactly. It's just something I've noticed. So the first thing I began coaching people, my hobby is running and triathlon, and so I picked up certificates. I mean, really, people just begin to offer you these trainings, and one day you're like, oh, well, yeah, I'll do that. Sure. So I picked up these certificates. I was coaching people for that for a while, and it was super fun, just a side hustle that went very well with my hobbies. And then after the pandemic, I actually began to mentor step parents. because
Ah,
that
yes.
was, when you're in the coaching world, they ask you this question, like, what is it, something that you've experienced that people ask you about?
Yep.
And like, just like the conversation we were having, they know that it's my story. They come up and they tell me their things. And so, and that's probably why I was so ready to answer those things about because I spent a lot of time really thinking about what were the things that we did that helped. Because in the minute when you're going through it, at least for me, because I didn't have a background in early childhood development or psychology or anything, is when I was going through it as a young stepmom and in the marriage, I was just trying to get through it. I was trying everything, taking advice from everywhere, reading, I didn't know that I would turn around and answer questions for people. But then I did sit down and think, I was like, so what were the things? I talked to my husband, I talked to my stepkids. What were the things we did that did make a difference for that? What were the things that got us into counseling? What were the
Yeah.
tools they gave us? And so that then I can share it, because there's not a lot of support out there for step parents. And it's hard to find it. So,
No kidding. I think I mean, all of parenting is kind of winging it.
yes.
Because you can't have like, this is the process for every situation that could possibly come up. And even if you had a process, it's always like, holy cow, we're dealing with this
Yeah.
now. Like, we did not see this coming, but here we are. And I've always told my kids, like, I'm human. I have my own story. Like, I'm creating my own story while I'm creating yours. And I don't always react the best. And I'm really sorry about that, because my goal was to everything that I was presented with, I was going to handle it perfectly. And I think for the most part, I don't look back, I wouldn't have changed a lot of the things that how I reacted to. But there are some. I mean, sometimes in the
Oh,
moment,
yeah.
you're like, holy crap. And then, you don't have a manual for how I'm going to deal with that. You wouldn't even remember the manual if you did, because random things happen all the time and you just have to jump in and figure it out. But I think if you have your kids as a priority and you know that you have to watch how you respond, you have a better chance of doing it pretty well. But
You
it's
do. I
it's
always
hard.
say there was a concept about, like, I think it was peaceful parenting that was out when my kids were young. And I read a lot of parenting books. I remember reading that and thinking it was a really nice idea. But at the same time, I always was like, yeah, but listen, when we're talking about last week, everyone had the flu, and now we're in the
Yeah,
Target with four kids under the age of 15, and somebody drops a bag of M&Ms or has a tantrum in the middle of the aisle. Not everybody in that moment can be peaceful. Sometimes it's, cut and run,
yeah,
survive to the next time. Just this, it's just, get through, and yeah, and then it can be hard to come back to the kids or the other people in the family and be like, so I didn't behave the way I would like to, and I'd like to, and do that repair.
yeah,
But I also think now that I would not have been able to say this 10 or 15 years ago, but I do think it's a wonderful example for our children when they get to watch us make mistakes and fix them, because they're going to do the same thing.
yeah,
And then we've shown them that those mistakes are not fatal, and that neither is apologizing and correct. I'm not some people are real resistant to apologizing, but
mm,
moving through it to the
yeah,
next stage. And
uh,
and so I offer people to be compassionate with themselves and know that if you don't handle things the way it can be
yeah,
so much pressure to be compassionate, to be conscious, to be peaceful, to be engaged, attached, whatever the words are we're using for, committed parents. And everybody does it differently. These things mean different things in every house, right? Um, but yeah, give a little bit of grace.
a lot. And I think so, like, gentle parenting, that whole thing was not around with most of my kids. And I'm glad, because I think certain things, they're like, this is how you should be all the time. I think it's an unrealistic expectation. I
Yes.
think we set unrealistic expectations, whether they come from an outside source or us internally. And then we constantly feel like we fail. And trust me, I fail every
100%.
day at parenting.
Every day. I was
100%.
I was a gentle parent from, 6:30 a.m. to about 1:30 maybe in the afternoon. It's pretty rare that you would find me gentle parenting, between 4:45 and 7, I was like, drill sergeant,
Yeah.
you
Well, and
know.
I don't think you don't need to beat your kids and be neglectful and abusive just because you're not gentle parenting.
Right.
There's so much in there, but I've noticed with my kids as they're having their own children with my grandkids, this whole gentle parenting is really setting them up. It's one more way that they feel like they're failing because they're not a Pinterest board. And I didn't have all that social media and all that pressure with my older kids.
Yeah.
So I honestly think that that was easier. They have so much outside pressure to do things a certain way and have things look a certain way that I think they just feel so much more pressure of failure and shame and guilt than I did. And I did a lot of that on my own. I didn't even need
Yeah.
outside help for that. But yeah, I think we need to
When
be careful.
At one point, I was griping in front of my dad about the fact that I didn't know where one of the kids was. Because that's another thing that's changed, right? Like everybody's got their phones and they're attached to everybody all the time. So I made a complaint. I was like, I don't know where this person is and they should check in. My dad just looked at me and he said, Oh, calm down. I don't think I knew where you were from 1988 to 1992. He was just like, this is going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I just so it's like that perspective of being able to have that it is going to be okay, and the
Yeah.
blessing of all the different things. Yeah.
It is true. I mean, with our older kids who didn't have phones and then did when they were 12, but they didn't have access to email and
Right.
social media. Like it was strictly to text and call. And the pictures were terrible. And
Right.
that was better. That was a great transition because we had the ability to have some contact without the distraction. And I actually, compared to us growing up, I was
Yep.
born in 70. Like I don't think nobody knew where we were for probably a decade. Um,
Right. Exactly.
it
Nobody knew,
was
and it was a blessing. I
it
used to
wasn't.
drive cross country
Yeah.
without a cell phone. I think back to it. I
Several
think back.
times.
Right. I would call and leave a message like I'm
Yeah.
in Indiana.
From a
Like
payphone
right.
at some gas station and you hoped you had change and it went from dimes to quarters. I mean,
Yep.
look, that wasn't necessarily ideal, although it was not as dangerous of a place to live at that point. Like
Right.
I didn't run into many dangerous situations where I felt afraid. Now I think that's more prevalent. And then now we have access to everything. And I think that's a disservice. But I liked that middle ground where it was a flip phone, where we could text and we had a little more communication,
Yeah.
but it was spotty. Um, so we had the ability to check in, but not the demand of the phone. And
Right.
that was a great middle ground to be in that we have bypassed. And this is actually harder. I think this
I think it's much harder, and
is
I
much
think
harder.
that I my kids, the youngest kids, I'd have to check in with the older kids. My younger kids have pulled back on their social media presence, and they sort of they just aren't doing it. But I had always said, I was like, oh, I feel like it's such a blessing that there are no photos of me getting in trouble, like, and doing things that I could have
Oh,
gotten caught for in high school and college, right? Like there was nobody filming, as we did, and now you can't walk down the street without being on somebody's door cam. So,
yeah, I definitely preferred how we grew up over how our kids right now are growing up. If I had to pick one, I'd go back to how things were, but the world would have to reflect to that. Um, it couldn't be sex trafficking everywhere and all this stuff, where I'm grateful that there are door cams in case you need them. Like that's a hard place to parent in when you're like, there's got
yeah,
to be a camera somewhere close by and we can figure this out. Like we didn't need to figure stuff out back when we were younger, it wasn't the same atmosphere. So yeah, I would take our upbringing over this any day. But so tell me how people can find you, what you do. I know it's newer, but you're not new to coaching and you're not
yeah.
new to step parenting and you're not new to parenting at this point. So bridge the gap for me and what you're doing now. And let's talk about that. I want people to know what you do and how they can find you and who you help.
Oh, absolutely. So this latest project is I call it the Art of Imperfect Adulting, and it's based on the idea that the journey of being an adult is long, and 18 to hopefully 100, right? And there's lots of different parts of that, and the through line, the thing that is in common in all of these different things, whether we're talking about parenting or caregiving or step parenting
Mhm.
or jobs or or midlife or menopause is the choices and the transitions that we make and the community that we build to support us. So, The Art of Imperfect Adulting, there's a show, it's a podcast that can be found everywhere, including YouTube. And I interview people and I ask them about the changes and decisions they've made in their life and how it has impacted how they lived. Everything from changing a major in school or changing careers or getting a divorce
Mhm.
or all of those things, dealing with grief. It's a wide variety of things. And then there's also a community on the back end, which is a group community where I help people with coaching tools on a theme. So, like the theme in July is joy and relaxation. And so we talk about tools to do that and to work on that based on anything that's going on in their life. And I call that the village.
Oh, I love it. I love how on your website you talk about very specifically, like it's not the age, it's not the midlife crisis,
Yeah.
it's not the decision. Like it's all of us all the time, anytime, moving through life. And that's awesome. I love that.
It came from, I think that I hope that people do resonate with it. I really do. I get good feedback from people, but that feeling of you have to go find a new expert and that feeling of you need to go find a new book or a new tool or something. I hit a point in my life where I would read something and I was like, this is the same
Yeah.
tool that I read about 10 years ago with a totally different problem. And like you were saying, things have changed with online. One of the things is that the information is so specialized for everything that I began to experience, and I think that other people have a similar experience. And I think it got worse after lockdown just because we all went online.
Hmm.
If you don't know who to ask and what question to ask, it's very hard to find information, even though there's more information than there ever
Yeah.
has been before. And so trying to bridge the gap of those things and empower people to be able to work through these things without feeling like they need to go hire another person or join a new program or burn down all the bridges. It's like, all right, so if I already knew how to do this one thing,
Yeah.
does that also apply over here?
I love that. Yeah, I think we have analysis paralysis basically now. There's so much information. I think it's inundating. Just with
Yeah.
parenting stuff. I mean, just as a
Yeah.
doula, like I always tell people, please don't get your information from TikTok.
Right. Although I will say, I've interviewed a couple people specific to ADHD as adults who
Okay.
got tips. So one of the ways that they found it helpful is that they were able to see things that they identified with. Like, so people would tell their
Okay.
stories and they were like, but that's a unique thing where like it's like they were underdiagnosed. It's not my own personal story, but both of the people that I interviewed about that, they both had been told like, don't diagnose yourself from TikTok. But on the flip side, they're like, TikTok was actually very helpful for me.
Which is great. I mean, I just
So,
think be aware of where you're getting your information and what it is and cross check it because there's
yes.
so much at this point. Amy, thank you so much for being on. We have all your links. I appreciate you.
Yay. Thank you.